Like all stories from history, this is a search for ghosts. A quest for the people who made us what we are, and for one man in particular.
William Shakespeare is the most famous writer of all time, and yet his life is still shrouded in mystery. So much so that a vast web of conspiracy theories has grown up over whether he even wrote his own plays or not. This is a historical detective story, an Elizabethan whodunit, searching for the life of William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, set against the turbulent times in which he lived.
We're walking up the ancient road. It's one of the old roads of England.
Are you walking all the way there?
Yeah. Bye.
So why go in search of Shakespeare? Can the life of a writer ever be as interesting or exciting as a conqueror, an inventor, or an explorer? A Napoleon, a Columbus, an Alexander the Great?
Well, yes. Yes, it can. More so, because the writers and the poets are the explorers of the human heart, and long after the conquerors are forgotten, their legacy will be the most valuable to us as human beings. And Shakespeare's the greatest writer who ever lived. Who wouldn't want to know what made him tick? And that's what I want to try to do on this journey.
Our search for Shakespeare will take us into the hidden landscapes of Elizabethan England and the secret archives of English history. Luckily for us, Elizabethan England was a police state. Its spies recorded everything. Through them, we can trace Shakespeare's connections from Warwickshire to the wilds of Lancashire. We can follow him into the teeming suburbs of Tudor London and find his landlady, his tax dodging, even his summons for grievous bodily harm. We'll pinpoint the site of his first playhouse, the place which ignited the golden age of the theatre. A time which has left its mark on our culture from that day to this, and which gave us the greatest gallery of characters in the literature of the world.
It's not often you get the chance to see a Shakespeare play done where his company did it.
If music be the food of love, play on! Give me excess of it!
Oh, Romeo. Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
What light is light, if Sylvia be not seen?
Put out the light. And then put out the light.
What angel wakes me from my flowery bed?
Blow wind and crack your cheeks! Rage! Blow!
To be or not to be? If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly.
If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended. That you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream.
And like all the best stories, the tale begins once upon a time, in the heart of old England. It starts in a small country town with the baptism of a little boy. And here's our first record of William. His baptism in the parish register at Stratford-upon-Avon.
We thank thee, Father, for the water of baptism.
1564, the 26th of April, William, the son of John and Mary Shakespeare.
Name this child. William, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
A third of all children then died in their first year. His mother and father had already lost 2 daughters.
That was all right, wasn't it?
William was their first child to survive. So you could say that from the start, he was lucky.
May God, who has received you by baptism into his church, pour upon you the riches of his grace. Amen.
But William was born in a time of revolution. In the mid-16th century, England was almost torn apart by religious conflict. Not long before William's birth, England's rulers had changed the national religion from Catholic to Protestant. And back to Catholic, and then back again. At stake was the spiritual authority of the Pope in Rome and the power of the English crown. England's rulers were the Tudors, a dysfunctional family if ever there was one. And the revolution had been started by one of the most repellent kings who ever ruled England, Henry VIII.
It was Henry who began the change, but it was his children who would drive the Protestant Reformation, change England forever, right down to the grassroots. The teenage Edward, cold-hearted Swat, ardent Protestant. And then his successor, his half-sister Mary, the other side of the coin, Catholic, fires of the Inquisitor burning inside her. She burned Protestant martyrs up and down the land. And then Elizabeth, what a childhood she had. Mother executed, abused and imprisoned in her youth, declared illegitimate just as Mary had been. Just think of it. 3 changes of the national religion in 12 years. And at the point Shakespeare's born, the very beginning of Elizabeth's reign, no one yet knows which way history is going to go.
Outside the big cities, the change from the old ways was slow. In the forest of Arden in Warwickshire, the Shakespeares had been country folk for generations.
Shakespeare was a country boy and a Warwickshire boy. Even at the height of his fame in London, he betrays his Warwickshire origins with his idiosyncratic spelling of Warwickshire pronunciation and by his use of Warwickshire dialect words. He calls the gnats around the cows the breeze, as the Warwickshire ploughman did.
He called the turn at the top of a furrow a headland. He has scores of country names for plants and flowers, from lark's heels to dead men's fingers.
And kexes. Which are these?
But although William was a country boy, he wasn't a peasant. His mother Mary's family, the Ardens, could trace their ancestry back before the Norman conquest. And in his mother's village of Wilmcote is a revealing clue about her family. William's maternal grandfather, Robert, was a well-to-do farmer who died just before Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. And at that point, the family was still loyal to the old faith. We can see that from the wording of Robert's will.
This is it. This is the document itself. I, Robert Arden, sick in body but good and perfect of remembrance, bequeath my soul to Almighty God and to our Blessed Lady St. Mary and to all the holy company of heaven. It's a Catholic will.
Stories, beliefs, traditions. The tale of someone's life begins before they're born. Deeper still into the forest of Arden is the ruined nunnery of Wroxall. Back in King Henry's day, before the Reformation, this was the Shakespeare's family church. This is the world of William's ancestors. Great-aunt Jane was a prioress here. Grandad Richard Shakespeare was bailiff. He sat in these stalls. All his life, Will loved this old world of the medieval kings and queens, the holy women and good friars of old England.
This place is part of Shakespeare's family memory. When you come here, you begin to understand that feeling for the English past that he grew up with and which later he conjures up in his plays. This is his deep roots.
But times of revolution are also times of opportunity.
39, 39, 39, good luck, 20, 50, 39, 50, 39, 50, have it.
Will's father, John, was ambitious to join the new Tudor middle class. He and Mary left the country and moved into Stratford.
Show me around, Miss Winfield.
John Shakespeare became a master glover. Leslie Winfield is one of only a handful still working today.
This trade does demand attention to detail. If the cutter doesn't do his job properly, none of the other people can. John Shakespeare was obviously selling gloves to important people, so, you know, they're a good craftsman and they're a bad craftsman. All the stitching, I imagine, was done by women, by hand.
So Mrs. Shakespeare might have helped her husband then?
She'd be lucky if she got away with that without doing something.
John and Mary worked hard and prospered. By the time William was born, they bought themselves a brand new house in Henley Street, with the last word in Tudor interior design.
Is this really what it would have looked like? This is what Mrs. Shakespeare would have had, is it?
This would have been her pride and joy. This was the best Dornix, very expensive fabric at the time for the Shakespeares.
Amazing. So, apart from being a country bumpkin, young William was brought up in quite a well-to-do house.
They were pretty upwardly mobile. John particularly wanted to make his mark on Stratford society.
And in Elizabethan England, you made your mark on society by joining the civic order. When William was 1, his father John was elected a town councillor.
4th of July, 1565. Meeting of the corporation, John Shakespeare elected an alderman. Aldermen present, Mr. Bailiff, Mr. Alderman, Mr. Smythe, Mr. Whately, Mr. Cowdray, Mr. Perrott, John Shakespeare, John Taylor, John Lewis, John Bell.
What you've got to remember was that Stratford at that time was the size that we would consider a village would be now. So it was a lot easier to keep a tight rein on things. And they were the justices of the peace as well. The two jobs went together. So they had a pretty good enforcement system.
That was true of John Shakespeare, Justice of the Peace and Alderman. And in the year that William was born, as I recall, John gave 12 pence for the relief of the poor. In that time, I think it was mostly those who were victims of the plague. And it mustn't be forgotten that Stratford lost between the 6th and the 7th of its population in the plague of that time.
John and his colleagues had sworn an oath to use their wit and cunning to look after the townsfolk. But in Elizabeth's divided realm, many in Stratford still leaned to the old ways. So to enforce the Queen's will, John and his fellows had to go against the feelings of many good friends and neighbours. And now, by government decree, the council was forced to deface the medieval religious paintings in their guild chapel. But rather than destroy them, they simply gave them a thin layer of whitewash. The future, after all, was still unclear. The paintings were uncovered in the 19th century. The old tales of English Christianity, St. George and the Dragon, the murder of Thomas Becket, and the Last Judgment, with its promise of heaven and the torments of hell. By government edict, all this was now childish superstition, and it had to go. In the Tudors' cultural revolution, the English people were to be liberated from the old thoughts and the old ways. And even from the old poetry, which John's generation had grown up with.
When earth upon earth hath builded his bowers, then shall earth for earth suffer many hard showers. When earth upon earth is brought within the brink, then shall earth upon earth have a foul stink. A warning against the vanity of earthly things. When John Shakespeare and his colleagues were ordered to deface all these walls, they weren't merely being asked to cover up a set of images. They were being asked to erase their own past.
But in William's boyhood, it was still possible to keep your beliefs to yourself, go to church now and then, and be all things to all men, and even to rise. In 1569, when William was 4, his father John was elected mayor. He was now the Queen's chief officer in Stratford.
Distinguished guests, councillors, ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to raise your glasses for the loyal toast. The toast, the Queen.
But loyalty to Queen or to religion was not yet a matter of life and death. And England's future, after all, was not John's generation, but William's. When William went to school, aged 7, in 1571, England was going through an educational revolution. There were 160 new schools in Elizabeth's reign. William's generation was to be the most literate so far in history. William was taught in this schoolroom. He and his classmates were the government's target generation. For them, grammar and Protestant godliness would go hand in hand.
Good. Docere, to teach.
William Shakespeare would have spent 6 days a week in this room from the age of 7, starting with breakfast at 6 and going on until 5:30 in the evening with a break for lunch. And they memorised prodigious amounts of material, beyond us today, I would guess. And at the core of it was Latin. This was the language of European high culture.
Yes, Alex.
The government kept a tight control of education, but it was the town council, including William's father, who chose the teachers.
Good. Docamus.
And of the 6 teachers in William's time, 4 were sympathisers with the old faith. Hunt became a Jesuit. Cottam later taught Catholic children up in Lancashire. So from the start, William must have seen the split in English society close up. But his school days weren't all religion and Latin. There was still time for make-believe. The Tudors loved plays, and the boys did them at school.
Yes, right in. Boys, please, can we get into position?
Royster Doyster!
This is one of their favourites, Ralph Royster Doyster.
Whose humour, the roisting sort, continually doth feed.
Thus, by
William would have acted this in front of his parents in this room.
by God's leave.
And grace. And here I take my leave for a certain space. Ah!
Like all school plays, behind the knockabout, there was a moral message.
You scoundrel!
Scoundrels get their just desserts.
I'm in love with your wit and your beauty, not with your riches.
Ah! Who is this?
And vanity gets taken down a peg.
No, say I. It's the 13th Hercules brother. I know not if I said well. Good Lord, preserve our most noble Queen of renown.
But politics were ever present. At the end, there was a song to drive home the government's message: the Queen is good and right.
So the Queen in her wisdom can end us all pain.
Though, of course, William's class would never have dared do such a cheeky finale.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
God, who did this?
So Perry, tell me about Royster Doyster then. This was actually written by a Tudor schoolmaster, was it?
Yes, yeah. I think sometimes to punish his boys. But yeah, you're right, Dan. Sorry, I'll leave you in a minute. Do you want to take that over and hang it up so we don't lose it? Yeah, I mean, it was the schoolmaster who was doing it to entertain his pupils, but I think as well as entertain, it was to instruct as well. You know, they had to learn from it.
So doing plays was a regular part of grammar school life in Tudor England, then, was it?
I'm sure it was, and I'm sure for much the same reasons as we do the plays today. You know, yes, it's an impressive thing to do, and we can study maybe plays that are on the curriculum, but more importantly than that, it's getting the boys working together, being part of the community, and you saw yourself in the performance how the spirit lifts. I mean, corny though it sounds, the magic of theatre. And it does, and they do, excuse me, David, something special comes out of it at the end. Yeah.
So the early years of Queen Elizabeth were golden days for the Shakespeares. A privileged education for William, and his father's business was expanding. John had clients right across southern England, and he was making money, more than you'd expect of a country glover.
This is the very edge of the Cotswold Escarpment.
The mystery of John Shakespeare's fortune brings us here to Gloucestershire.
So how far can you see on a good day from here?
All depends how good your eyes are. Now you can see a fair old way.
Years later, in his play on Richard II, Shakespeare describes this view from this spot.
That's Lydney. Lydney over there. And if you come slightly forward of that, look a little green line in the trees. Well, that is the roof of Berkeley Castle.
Gosh.
There stands the castle, he wrote, by yon tuft of trees.
Is it still in use, is it?
Oh yes, that is the parish
And in a play on Henry IV, he even gives the names of real people up here, the Perkses and the Vizards.
Yeah, it is a Vizard. In loving memory.
Poor old George Vizard he's very rude about, calls him an arrant knave.
Yeah. Mary Vizard, elder daughter of Arthur. Yeah. Arthur Vizard.
Now the Vizards were dealers in wool, the most valuable commodity in Tudor England, protected by a state monopoly. And here in the Public Record Office in London, the reports of Elizabeth's spies show how it was policed.
So this is government recording its...
And in these documents, David Thomas recently discovered the source of John Shakespeare's wealth.
Yeah. It's written on parchment, and there was no need in the 16th century to produce things like that. Books had been invented. It was just made like this because of the people who wrote this got fees, and that's why they did it.
And poor old John got caught up in the whole thing.
He got caught up in that whole unpleasant process, yep. This is it.
Oh, yes. This
Shakespeare.
John Shakespeare. So what's happened?
Well, it's James Langbrake is making an information, and he says quitam for, so much for himself and so much for the Queen. So he's asking for a share of a fine, which is going to be imposed on Shakespeare, which is what it's all about.
He's an informer? Or
Absolutely, yeah, he's an informer. And he's saying that John Shakespeare had bought 200 tods of wool illegally from a Walter Newson.
God, it's amazing, isn't it, that an important document like this can be on Shakespeare can be discovered so recently. Actually,
it is extraordinary. I mean, there must be other things yet undiscovered, but I think it's a very important document because it shows the size of Shakespeare's father's wool dealing operations.
What kind of money was he dealing in then?
Well, I mean, he was dealing in £5,600 weight of wool, which is a huge, 2 tons of wool.
Wool was weighed always by the tod, and a tod is 28 pounds. When the larger farms and the monasteries broke up, the shepherd so much land and what have you. In some cases, the shepherds had more sheep than the landlord. And this is where the travelling wool merchants came in, and they were known as woolmen or broggers.
So Shakespeare's father was a brogger, an illegal wool dealer. And William knew about their world. Later in his plays, he even gets the prices right. Perhaps as a boy, he'd been on trips with his dad. Brogging paid well. At a time when £50 could buy you a good house, you could make hundreds on a single deal, if you got away with it.
And this is from about the same time?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And what's this case? What's he done for you? It's kind of criminal history of our bard's family.
He's done for money lending. An informer called Anthony Harrison, who's coming, and he's saying that John Shakespeare had lent some money to John Musson, £100.
Cool.
That's a lot of money, isn't it?
Wow.
And he'd required £20 interest for the loan of £100.
£20 interest on 100.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. What happens in this case is that they issue a writ for Shakespeare to come and to be prosecuted, and he offers to pay a fine of 40 shillings, which he does.
To the government?
To the government,
government,
but half of that would go to the informer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, so the government are employing the informer?
Oh,
in fact,
yeah.
God, right.
Yeah, it's,
God, so this is a real world of... you've got to watch your back all the
Absolutely.
time in Elizabethan England.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah,
Crikey.
it really is just an extraordinary world.
And it was an extraordinary world. William's boyhood in the 1570s.
Openly to all! Wonderful is man's failing!
Elizabeth's England must have been a schizophrenic place. The old religion still in so many hearts, and the new secular age waiting to be born. And young Will grew up right in the middle of it.
This woman that we in Folly found.
When he was a boy, his parents took him to Coventry to see the mystery plays.
All holy in his hand. King Pharaoh, my father was!
The mysteries told the great stories of the Bible, the creation, the flood, and the fall.
Eat.
They were simple tales, which everyone knew, but they opened up the deepest feelings. The Coventry mystery plays were closed down when William was 15, banned as childish superstition. But you can see from his own plays that William never forgot them. He loved them for their raw power and their rude humour.
Come here to blow directly, and I will begin to make them presently. I will blow like a good fella. There is no smith in all this country who blows so well as I with his bellows. Oh, thou blowest like a dirty fellow. Oh, forgive thy father! I know not what they do. Lord Christ, think of me when thou shalt be in thy kingdom.
When Will was 9 in 1573, he moved into big school. And one day, the new master, Mr. Hunt, introduced him to poetry.
We've all got our favourite books, haven't we? And Shakespeare's certainly was Ovid. He knew the Latin text, but he also knew this, the English translation by Arthur Golding, which came out when Shakespeare was 3 and went through many editions. It was a very popular book. It's hard for us to imagine, isn't it, in our electronic age, the effect that a book like this could have on the imagination of a child back then. But one of Shakespeare's contemporaries describes that first feeling and love for literature that he got from reading Ovid. When I was 7 or 8 years old, he says, I used to steal away and hide myself from all other delights to read this book.
Now, since the sea's great surges sweep me on, all canvas spread, hear me, in all creation nothing endures, all is in endless flux, each wandering shape a pilgrim passing by, and time itself glides on in ceaseless flow, a rolling stream, and streams can never stay, nor light foot ours, as wave is driven by wave, and each pursued pursues the wave ahead. So time flies on and follows, flies and follows always, forever new. What was before is left behind, what never was is now, and every passing moment...
Born in a time when religious certainty had gone, was this the moment when William realised that poetry could fill the void?
In all creation be assured, there is no death, but only change and innovation. What we men call birth is but a different new beginning. Death is but to cease to be the same. Perhaps this may have moved to that, and that to this, yet still the sum of things remains the same.
But sooner or later, every child has to grow up and discover the reality outside the safety of the home and the classroom. In 1576, when Shakespeare was 12, his golden childhood ended. His father's business suddenly collapsed, and his parents started selling off the family property, including Will's inheritance from grandfather Robert in Wilmcote. Here's the deed of sale, and there's his mother's seal. Now that year the wool industry had been hit by a recession and the government was clamping down hard on illegal dealers like John.
But there's more to it than that, because at the same time John stops attending council meetings here in the Guildhall chamber. After 12 years of loyal service, he'd been the mayor and now he gives it up. And the reason may be to do with his religion, because at this point the government's really putting the squeeze on the followers of the old faith. But for William, the effect was that his father took him out of school early. And at the age of 14, he found himself cut off from the chance of higher education and of going to university.
According to a 17th century diarist, Will had to work for his father at home. Quite a come down for the boy who'd fallen in love with Ovid.
So leather comes in many different guises then, Mark.
Certainly does.
Shakespeare talks about chevril, which is kid skin, isn't it? He uses it as a metaphor for somebody's conscience that stretches like a piece of chevril from an inch narrow to an L wide. Now tell us about the property of the kind of leather that can do that.
Well, once again, with these smaller species of animal, like goat, calf, kid, the leather that results is actually really quite flexible. I mean, if you see that, that'll stretch, and you see how it's staying there. So if somebody had a conscience of that nature, you'd have to be careful, I think.
And conscience was to be the issue in the next phase of the battle for hearts and minds in Elizabeth's England. In the summer of 1580, Jesuit missionaries sent by the Pope in Rome arrived in secret off the coast of England. Their leader, the charismatic Oxford scholar Edmund Campion, landed in disguise at Dover.
Campion arrived on the 12th of June here in Dover, disguised as a gentleman. But Elizabeth's port police knew who was coming, and they had artists' impressions based on the descriptions of double agents who'd penetrated the Catholic colleges in Reims and Rome. And they actually picked Campion up and interrogated him for a while. Then they let him go.
Campion's aim, as he saw it, was nothing less than to save the soul of England and its 1,000-year history. From London, the missionaries split up. Some headed for the heartland of the old faith in Lancashire, and some went into Warwickshire. From the reports of Elizabeth's spies, we can trace their route on the back roads through the Forest of Arden.
God, it's a huge moat.
They stayed here with the Catesbys at Lapworth. And with the Grants, John Shakespeare's business partners near Snitterfield. And in the Ferrers' house at Baddesley Clinton. But they brought a fateful message for English Catholics, who till now had been able to square their loyalty to their Queen and to their faith. It was now a mortal sin to go to Protestant church. The time for compromise was over. As for Elizabeth, excommunicated by the Pope, fearing assassination by fanatics, there could no longer be an in-between. She moved against the Catholics.
This is the sureties case of June 1580. Nearly 200 people are hauled in by the government on the grounds of national security. And here we are. John Shakespeare. He's called in to appear in London with somebody else here. John Audley, of the town of Nottingham in the county of Nottingham, hat maker. And John Audley stands surety for John Shakespeare, and John Shakespeare stands surety for John Audley. And there's another person down here, Thomas Cooley, from Stoke in the county of Staffordshire, a yeoman. He stands surety for John Audley and for John Shakespeare. What's the link between these people?
The truth is, no one knows. But the date on the surety, the 22nd of June, is the day of the pilgrimage to St. Winifred of Holywell. Out on the Welsh borders, Holywell was a rallying place for Catholics through Elizabeth's reign. They came to take its healing waters and left their graffiti on its walls. It's the only pilgrimage in Britain which has survived unbroken from before the Reformation. Was this where John was that June? That's just a hunch, I admit. Except, that is, for an extraordinary discovery made long ago, of all places, in the roof of the Shakespeare's house in Stratford. A mysterious document now lost, in which William's father named his patron saint, Winifred of Holywell.
In April 1757, a workman up here in the attic discovered a small paper booklet. It was a handwritten Elizabethan Catholic Testament of Faith, hidden between the rafters and the tiles. What they didn't know, and what we do, is that it was actually copied from the contract, the Testament of the Soul, composed in Italy, which was brought in by Edmund Campion's Jesuit mission, and it bore the name of John Shakespeare.
But while Will's father was embroiled in national politics, his son's thoughts were much closer to home. Will was 18 in 1582, and like any boy in his late teens, his thoughts turned to love. That summer, he was reading the hot book of the year, Tom Watson's new collection of English love sonnets, and he was hoping to practice them on the daughter of a Shottery farmer, a business partner of his dad. She was 8 or 9 years older than him, and her name was Anne Hathaway.
Hathaways had lived in this house for 300 years, and the family tradition is that this is the settle on which William and Anne conducted their courtship. But the truth is, we don't know anything about their courtship. In fact, we know very little about Anne herself. Considering her importance, she's the most mysterious character in the whole story. We've got her father's will, but it doesn't tell us anything about her character. And we don't know what she looked like. There is a drawing, this one, done in 1708, traced from an earlier image. How would you describe her? Soberly attractive woman? But is it Anne?
So often in the search for Shakespeare, we can only talk in maybes. But on the afternoon of Tuesday, November the 27th, 1582, we know exactly where he was. He was here, walking past the tomb of King John in Worcester Cathedral, down the south aisle and into the church court.
Hello, Robin. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
You see, Anne was pregnant and they needed a marriage license, fast. And in the archives here, they still have Will and Anne's license. But as with so many Shakespeare documents, there's a twist.
Entry here, William Shakespeare, spelled with an X, and Anna Whately of Temple Grafton.
William Shakespeare and Anne Whately, not Anne Hathaway.
Not Anne Hathaway.
So could William really have promised himself to two different women?
Over all the years that I've been trying to explain this to people, and you come up with all the ones that people say, the romantic novel version that, Anne Hathaway tears him away from Anne Whately and says, "You're not marrying her, you're marrying me," and these are the sort of the bodice-ripping romantic novel stories. I think it's just a slip.
It's rather sad, isn't it? The second Anne, just a clerical error by an overworked clerk who'd been dealing with Whately's the same day.
It's a pity, isn't it? You imagine the beautiful young teenage Anne Whately, the woman who's passionately in love with, and he's got to marry the one who's 27 and long in the tooth and whatever.
Expecting a baby.
And expecting a baby, yes.
Now, in Tudor times, you couldn't marry during the 6 weeks of the Christmas season. So they must have done it with a day to spare on St. Andrew's Day, November the 30th, 1582. But it's the place that's interesting. The place named in the licence, Temple Grafton.
With my body I honour you.
With my body I honour you.
All that I am I give to you.
All that I am I give to you.
And all that I have I share with you.
The vicar, John Frith, is one of those minor characters who just leap off the pages of Elizabethan government reports. He was skilled at cures. The government spy says that he knew how to heal wounded hawks, and many people came here for that reason. But the chief thing is that John Frith was an old Catholic priest. He drew up Catholic-style wills, and a couple of years before, he'd been reported for holding weddings out of the appointed season and without the reading of the banns 3 times. So he'd done it before. He was the sort of person you came to if you were in a hurry, or if you wanted a wedding more in tune with the old faith.
For his wedding feast, William composed a sonnet. He pinched the idea from Tom Watson's Book of Love Poems. By his standards, it's not very good, but it's his first known poem, and he wrote few more touching pieces in his life. It's addressed to his new wife, and it puns on Anne's name, Hathaway.
Those lips that love's own hand did make breathe forth the sound that said, I hate, to me that languished for her sake. But when she saw my woeful state, straight in her heart did mercy come, chiding that tongue that ever sweet was used in giving gentle doom, and taught it thus anew to greet. I hate, she altered with an end that followed it as gentle day doth follow night, who like a fiend from heaven to hell is flown away. I hate, from hate away she threw, and saved my life, saying, not you.
"5 months later, William and Anne's first child was born, Susanna. And they must have been living here in Henley Street, squashed in with his parents and his 3 younger brothers and his sister.
It's often said that William had to marry Anne, that he can't really have loved a farmer's daughter. But he was a farmer's son, after all. And think about it another way. William was 18, he was vulnerable, his dad had been ruined. Anne was several years older and experienced in the world. She'd be the rock back home here in Stratford on which his career would rest. So maybe it was true what he wrote in that teenage poem, that Anne saved my life.
But in 1583, Will's prospects were not looking bright. He'd already lost the chance of university, and by marrying he'd barred himself from an apprenticeship. And now, if a famous legend is true, he fell foul of the law in the person of the most powerful local lord, Sir Thomas Lucy.
Welcome to Chalker, near Wellesbourne, about 4 miles from Stratford. We've got an 85-hectare park, well wooded, and the deer, of course, are fallow deer. They've been here since around 1460, and this is where one of the sons of Stratford, one William Shakespeare, allegedly came to fill his larder.
Shakespeare's crime, so the legend says, was to poach Lucy's deer. Lucy was so angry he had him beaten and jailed, and then kicked him out of town.
What sort of impression do you have of him as a man?
From looking at that?
Yeah. And from what you know of him, yes, from the family documents and traditions.
I'm just a very straightforward sort of character.
Yes, yes.
Perfectly reliable, rather trustworthy.
Yeah. And that's Queen Elizabeth. Did she ever come here?
She came here in August 1572 and was here for, was it 2 days? Yeah. No doubt costing a lot of money and upsetting all the servants. And
a lot of cooking involved.
A lot of cooking, yes.
But behind the poaching myth, I think, is a much more sinister tale which takes us into the dark heart of the Elizabethan state. And it starts in the autumn of 1583, when Will was 19.
This is Ainhoe in Buckinghamshire. And what happened here that October night would have fateful results for all the Catholics in Warwickshire, but especially for the Arden family, the family of Shakespeare's mother.
On the 26th of October, a young man called John Somerville arrived at this inn. He was the son-in-law of Edward Arden, head of the oldest family in Warwickshire and Shakespeare's cousin.
Whether Somerville was mad, mentally deranged, we don't know. But that night here, he announced to the people in the inn that Queen Elizabeth was a heretic and he intended to go to London and assassinate her.
Mad or not, it wasn't the kind of thing to say with spies lurking round every corner. The government decided there was a plot by the Ardens, and to root it out, Elizabeth turned to none other than her friend Sir Thomas Lucy. And this, I think, is the real link between Lucy and the Shakespeares. On the 31st of October, good old Sir Thomas issued a warrant for the arrest of Arden's family and to search the houses of anyone related to them.
This is Saxton's map of 1576. Look, you can see Stratford there. It's only about 6 miles up to the Catholic houses around Lapworth and Baddesley, both of them marked. And maybe 15 miles up to Park Hall. That's the house of Edward Arden, the main branch of the Arden family, within the area of what's now Birmingham. Here you go. So this was Edward Arden's backyard here. Let's just go and have a look at the river here. There's a wonderful description of it with stepping stones, shrouded with woods, kingfishers diving. Look at it today. It takes all sorts to make a historical landscape, doesn't it? What must have been quite good stonework here. Lots of Victorian bricks, as you'd expect, because the place was rebuilt many times, lived in until 100 years ago. But flat Tudor bricks as well. This looks like a wall here, doesn't it?
Arden and his family were arrested and taken to London. A secret prison diary gives the chilling build-up to the Ardens' tragedy. November the 6th, Edward Arden brought to the Tower. The same day, his friend Francis Throgmorton arrested and put in the torture chamber known as Little Ease. 13th of November, Arden's wife and daughter brought to the Tower. 23rd of November, Edward Arden severely tormented on the rack. But still there was no proof of Arden's treason. And nor, back in Charlcote, could Lucy find any.
Unless you can make Somerville and Arden's wife and Somerville's wife speak directly to those things you desire to have discovered, it will not be possible for us here to find out more than is found already. For the papists in this country greatly do work upon the advantage of clearing their houses of all shows of suspicion.
Elizabeth's torturers never found evidence of Arden's guilt. But Arden and Somerville and their wives were sentenced to death. On the eve of his execution, so the government said, poor mad Somerville committed suicide in his cell. The next day, Edward Arden, the head of Shakespeare's mother's family, was executed in front of the early morning crowds by the meat market here at Smithfield.
Public execution was a long drawn-out theatre of cruelty in Elizabethan England, and you were lucky if you were dead before they got on to the really gruesome bits, disemboweling you and burning your entrails in front of your eyes. And that was before the butchery began. And you could see that sort of thing in every public space in every major town in England. But when it happened to a member of your family, that was different.
Such cruel injustice at the hands of the state can mark you for life. And as we shall see, William never forgot. So there's the first 19 years of Shakespeare's life. He'd seen his father rise to the top and then lose it all. He'd learned what it's like to be privileged and to be an outsider, to live one life in public and another in private. He'd married and become a father, and he'd seen his family branded as traitors. And that's just the beginning of the story. In the next part of our search for Shakespeare, we'll uncover the mystery of William's lost years.
And William Shakespeare.
That with friendly grace of smoothed brow have entertained the Scythian Tamburlaine.
And we'll follow him to London and the beginning of the career of the greatest writer the world has ever seen.